All right, well, let's get into today's interview. With us today is the Utah Jazz insider for KSL Sports. You can hear him 10 to 12 on the KSL Sports Zone. And of course, you can find him on Instagram and Twitter at Ben's Hoops. It's Mr. Ben Anderson. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. It's draft season, so we want to get all the experts we can on right now to get their draft knowledge. But before we get into all that and jazz talk, I'd like to learn more about Ben if we can here. So I have what we call some rapid fire questions. These are just some questions I'm going to ask them to you. Just answer them as quickly as you can, as honestly as you can, and hopefully it'll help us get to know you a little better. All right. First question: what is your favorite fast food place?
Oh, probably full like McDonald's. You know what? Let's go Popeyes.
All right. Second question: what is your all-time favorite movie? And then what is the last movie you saw in the theater?
Probably The Shining would be my favorite movie, and then the last movie I saw in the theater, I saw the second Spider-Man Enter the Spider-Verse movie.
What'd you think of it? Did you like it?
Yeah, it was good. I didn't realize it was the first half of a sequel, so I took my
Oh,
kids, and I didn't realize there's a second part coming. So it was good though.
yeah. I found it a little. I love those kind of movies, but I found it a little all over the place. Even me, I mean, obviously it's the multiverse. I understand that, but even me, I was like, "What the heck? This is a little much." So I can understand kids probably getting a little confused with it.
Yeah, I'm sure my 7-year-old didn't know what was going on.
All right, next question: who is your all-time favorite artist or band, and what is the last concert you went to?
Let's see. Last concert I went to. Boy, it wasn't that long ago. I feel like I should remember this one. Man, it was not that long ago. You know what? I really went like the band Turnstile right now, and I went and saw them last year. I know I've been to I went and saw Pixies at the Utah Festival just a couple of weeks ago. I love Pixies. That might be my answer.
Dude, that is crazy that you say that because I am actually 1 week from today going to Blink 182 concert in San Jose, and they're the opening band. So I'm just becoming familiar with them. First off, it's crazy that they're the opening band for Blink 182 because their sounds don't match at all.
No.
But I'm really digging those guys. They're a cool band and their energy is really fun too.
Yeah, they're pretty loud. The shows are pretty intense, so maybe a little more intense than Blink 182. So be prepared for that. For the diehard fans who go to see Turnstile, it'll be a different show.
Oh yeah, I'm for sure. All right, and our last question here is, who is on your Utah Jazz draft bust Mount Rushmore? So some players that you think were the biggest bust for the Utah Jazz. If you can
Well,
give
I'll
us
just
that.
own that I thought Jared Butler was going to be really good, and he's not on the roster anymore. And some of that I think had to do with things that were out of my knowledge range, which were that he had really bad knees coming into the draft, apparently, which wasn't really reported. Everyone knew about his heart issue, but that got cleared, but nobody had really publicly talked about his knees, and I learned about that after the fact. His also fit in the locker room for whatever reason. I don't know what it was. Wasn't perfect. I don't think he was a bad guy by any means. It just didn't quite match what I think the vibe was for the team. Though I think that roster last year was pretty difficult to find a spot in. Man, draft busts. That's one. I thought Morris Almond was going to be pretty good. Morris Almond stinks.
Wow.
That's a throwback. He had some issues as well, just trying to fit in. Let's go Chris Humphries and Kirk Snyder. The first time the Jazz really had a opportunity in the lottery. I remember Larry H. Miller was excited, and then the Jazz didn't move up at all. And the picks right after Chris Humphries and Kirk Snyder were Josh Smith and Al Jefferson, who both ended up being much better players at those identical positions. So the Jazz blew that draft pretty badly.
I gotta say, you surprised me. I for sure thought you were gonna mention Exum. I'm not gonna lie.
Exum, his injuries were majorly his issues. So yes, he busted because he didn't make it, but the guys who really were just like total misreads, and it's hard to say, a guy drafted in the second round, that was more my misread than anybody on Jared Butler. Morris Almond, again, late first round pick, but just didn't translate at all to the NBA, just couldn't do anything other than shoot. And then really don't think the Jazz did a good job scouting Chris Humphries or Kirk Snyder because they didn't match the Jazz culture at all. They didn't do any of the things they were supposed to do in college. And they washed out extremely quickly and are actually weirdly more famous for things they did off the floor than on the court, which is never a good sign.
No, definitely not. All right, so one final way of us getting to know you, if you could, just give us maybe a quick rundown of Ben. Like, where are you from? What did you enjoy growing up? Did you play any sports? Just maybe like a quick short paragraph about yourself and how you got to where you are in your profession today.
Yeah, I'm a Utah native. Went to Highland High School, so I've been in Salt Lake my whole life, with the exception of a couple of times I lived in Florida just for very short stints, but nothing, that I would be able to call that a hometown by any means. I was a skateboarder growing up, but was always really into basketball. Basketball was probably my first love, but I wasn't very good at it. And I kind of had to choose as a ninth grader whether I wanted to skateboard or play basketball. And I didn't even try out for the freshman team. I skateboarded instead, and that ended up working out well because I ended up doing that for a long time and kind of helped me form an identity. But at the same time, I always liked basketball, so I was a pretty diehard junkie. And I didn't think about it at the time, but even as like a 16-year-old, I was listening to sports radio in my car pretty religiously, not thinking that was something I'd ever be able to do. But I randomly, my friend in high school, his stepdad, I guess his mom's boyfriend, was Phil Miller, who was the old Utah Jazz beat writer for the Tribune. And I think that gave me some access of understanding that, like, oh, normal people have these jobs. This isn't a job that you have to go out and like be famous or know somebody to get the job. It's just everyday people working these jobs. And I think that was my first kind of understanding that those were accessible. And then I got an internship with David Locke in 2011 during the lockout season. And it just kind of was right place at the right time from there on out.
So did you go to college or university at all for this, or tech school, or did you just kind of work your way up?
I was an English major. I was going to be a high school teacher. That was my goal. But I got an internship with the Jazz, and I thought that was way more fun. And it was the first time I had any real career direction outside of just, silly part-time jobs. So I trusted it and stuck with it and, went through quite a bit, but was never too difficult and got where I am now.
Awesome. That's a cool story. I like to hear that. All right, well, let's move into some basketball Jazz talk here. First, let's look back on the last season. I would like to know, what was the number one thing that absolutely surprised you the most about last year's season for the Jazz?
I guess how little changed from the year before. Like, the issues that they had were the exact same issues that they had 2 years ago. They were the same issues they had last season. Well, I guess I should say that's the end of the Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert era. Sorry, I'm still in the middle of thinking we're in the 2021-22 season and 2022-2023. So that era blowing up was surprising to me because it seemed like they did so little to change what was possible. And then I guess what changed last season, other than obviously everything, I think some of the surprises were, that they won 37 games and probably pretty easily could have won 41 or more had they kept everyone on the floor in the second half of the season. Clearly that wasn't the goal, but the fact that they were that competitive, even going into the second half of the season and could have won more games, I certainly didn't expect that. I was angling for a 25-win team that wasn't going to be all that enjoyable to cover, but they were fun. I mean, that was just a very fun basketball team. That part of it didn't surprise me because I remember watching the 03-04 Jazz team that didn't win. They won 42 games, so it was more than even last year. But bad teams are fun to watch. I mean, young teams are fun to watch. There's something new, and the status quo has been shaken up. And I think that's actually more interesting than like what we saw those last 2 years with Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell.
So being someone that gets to go into, Jazz practices, games, and meet players and stuff like that, obviously last season there was a lot of outside noise about how bad the team was going to be and they're going to be one of the worst teams, blah, blah, blah. As someone like in the media, do you feel like that affected the team at all, or were they able to brush that off pretty well?
I think they hear it, and I think it probably created an edge, the same way that expecting to win a national or an NBA championship or to compete for a title, I think also weighs on people. I think that can happen to good teams, and it can really affect them if they're not prepared for it. And then teams that people expect very little of, even though they have, quite a few veterans like the Jazz did last season, they take that as a challenge and will push back on it. And I think they did. And I think that helped carry them and motivated them. I think, you can't rely on that year after year. So you've got to create a new identity going into next season. You've got to continue to redefine yourself. And that can be difficult, which is why I could see them losing or winning fewer games next season than they did last year. But I do think certainly the outside expectations fueled them a little bit going into the year.
Do you feel like this, obviously we don't really know. It's so early into the offseason right now, and we don't know what the team's going to look like really, but do you think they'll have some of that same outside noise going into the next season, or because of how well they did last season, will that probably be volume down on it?
I think there's still going to be enough people. If you're going to go out and, kind of stack up the West next year, they're still going to be projected to be, I think, 13th or 14th by a lot of outlets nationally. Denver's obviously going to be the favorite. Lakers are still good. Golden State's still good. Memphis probably drops back, but it's still going to be good. Sacramento drops back, but it's still going to be good. People are going to like Phoenix. People are going to like the Clippers. But, it's just the normal names that you would expect. Dallas obviously is going to be in the conversation still. New Orleans is going to be in the conversation still. I'm excited to see what they do over the next week, I guess, leading up to the draft, as they've been mentioned in some of the more exciting draft rumors. But that really only leaves, the Jazz, the Rockets, and the Spurs. And I think those are going to be the bottom three teams again, most likely, barring some drastic changes for the Jazz.
So obviously one of the biggest surprises last year was just the improvement of Lauri Markkanen, and he even wins the award for it. There's always a lot of chatter for a team to be as good, like the Nuggets, to be as good as they are, they got to have that number one guy, like how they have Joker. Can Markkanen truly be that number one guy for the Jazz, or do you feel he's more of the number 2 or 3 guy possibly?
I think if he does what he did last year, he is a number one guy. Like, that's what's exciting if you're a Jazz fan, is he's already doing number one guy things. There wasn't real question about how that would translate. Now let's see what happens when he gets to the playoffs. Some guys dip down, some guys jump up. Jamal Murray's a much better playoff player than he is regular season player. Can Lauri Markkanen continue to do that in the playoffs? Some of that stuff I just don't think you know until you get there. So that's a little bit unanswerable, but 25 points a game, and really over the second half of the season, minus, kind of towards the end there, he was up closer to 30, unbelievable shooting efficiency. I mean, has those games where he makes 4 baskets and scores 28 points. That's pretty unheard of because he can get to the line. He's obviously a deadly 3-point shooter. So I do think he's a number one option. Is he, a number one option the same way Kevin Durant is or Devin Booker is at this point in his career? Maybe he's not quite, top 5 number one options in the NBA, but he's extremely, extremely good. And you're going to need a complimentary scorer to go with him. But, he can do all the things you need in the modern NBA. And considering he's only 26 years old, I think there's going to be a lot more to add to his game.
So one of my favorite guys on the team right now that I don't think I know a lot of Jazz fans don't really talk about is Fontecchio. I mean, last year when he was playing in FIBA stuff, I was like, guys, we signed this dude. You should be checking him out. He's pretty cool. Obviously, he struggled a little bit with the season last year, but I feel like toward the end, he kind of started getting a little more comfortable and stuff. Do you think there's any possibility next season that he'll feel more better with the system, feel better being in Utah, that he can maybe up his game and people will come around to knowing him better?
Yeah, I just think the fact that he's not moving countries and, playing basketball in a new town is going to be a huge benefit for him in a new world for him. He didn't shoot the ball particularly well in the first half of the season, but was pretty productive towards the end of the year. Had 4, maybe 20-point games late in the season over kind of those last 25. Now, how much you want to believe in those last 25 games in the season, I think is very debatable, especially with this Jazz team. Like, how much do you believe in Talen Horton-Tucker? How much do you believe in what Chris Dunn did? I think those are serious questions, and Simone Fontecchio certainly fits into that conversation, as does Ochai Agbaji. But the fact that he looked at times like he was a clear NBA player, I think is promising enough that there's growth opportunities for him. And he's got an NBA skill, and he's a great shooter. When he's open, he really has a chance to knock down not just a 3 or a couple of threes in a game. I mean, he can hit 4, 5 3-pointers in a game. There's not a ton of people on the planet that can do that at the NBA level. So he's going to get an opportunity to grow and continue. I don't know if he's a long-term fit with the Jazz, but I would say that basically about everybody, considering how early it is in this rebuild.
Speaking of a player that I feel that some Jazz fans maybe overrate a little bit, and that's Ochai. I love the guy and stuff, but I just feel like some Jazz fans are maybe overrating him just a tad. How important do you feel Summer League is going to be for him this year? Is that going to be something he just really needs to show where he can be next season? Is it that important for him?
I think it would be nice for his confidence level if he came out and dominated a little bit. If he came down and just hit a bunch of shots and looked like the best player on the floor, and considering the opportunities he's had over the last, I guess since January 9th that he got into the rotation full time, whatever the date was, maybe it was the 3rd. Some of those games, notably, Chicago, I want to say in Houston, if I remember correctly, where he was just like, really at moments, maybe a full quarter, he was the best player on the floor. I would like to see a half where he's the best player on the floor. And that's what I've seen covering Summer League, especially here in Salt Lake, as closely as I have. Like, Jaren Jackson would have his first year here with Memphis. Like, he had a quarter, and I was like, man, this guy was the number 4 pick. Like, he didn't do anything. And then for about 8 minutes, he hit 4 threes, blocked 3 shots, got 7 rebounds. It was just like, oh, I get it. Like, you totally saw it. He just totally was engaged. And when he wanted to be engaged, he took over. I would like to see Ochai do that if you're believing in him taking that next step and maybe trying to win the starting shooting guard spot next year for the roster. He needs to be good enough at that point to win in Summer League and to dominate some of these Summer League games. And I know his percentages don't really bear it out, but I got to the point late in the season where I thought every time Ochai shot the ball, it was going in.
Cool.
It looked that pure to me by the time of the end of the year. Maybe he doesn't, but his physicality, his age, the experience he has now, he should really play well at Summer League.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not trying to disrespect the guy. I like his game and everything. I just feel like there's some Jazz fans, and I'm sure you deal with this all the time too, with on online Twitter, social media stuff. Some people, it's just like, this guy's untouchable. You can't trade him. It's like, calm down a second. He's not an all-star. He wasn't even on the rookie, game there. So let's give the guy a break here and see what he does this summer. But all right, well, let's move into some draft talk here. Obviously, the Jazz, as of right now, have the 9th, 18th, and 28th picks. Before we get into some questions, I want to have some trivia fun here with you. So the Utah Jazz with the 9th pick, they've only had that pick once in the whole history of the franchise. Do you know who it was they drafted with that 9th pick?
Gordon Hayward.
All right. Perfect. You passed that one. All right. Let's see this one. With the 18th pick, do you know who the last player was at the Jazz? What was that?
They had the 16th pick.
Oh, why am I saying 18? See, I'm all over the place. 16th. Well, that ruins that question because I was looking at 18. Boy, this has been a long day for me. All right, let's move to 28th pick. How about this? Okay. Yep. Do you remember the last player the Utah Jazz drafted with the 28th pick?
Probably wasn't that long ago, would be my guess. Man, was it Tony Bradley?
It's actually been a long time ago. It was in 1999 with Scott Padgett.
Okay.
It's been a minute. It was close though. They drafted Doak with the 27th, so it was kind of close there. But boy, I feel stupid. I was saying 18th. Boy, that's
right.
This is when you guys look over your notes, just for everyone watching this, and you're trying to get into broadcasting or podcasting. Check your notes 3 times before you start doing the interview. So obviously, we're right now when we're recording this, we're a week away from the draft. A lot can change between now and then. But right now, my recording, who are the top 3 guys on your board for the Jazz?
I'm not sure I do a board so much. I know a lot of guys get into that. Really what I like to look at, because I'll tell you the truth, I'm not watching the top 4 players that are projected in this draft. Like, I haven't watched outside of just kind of the obvious stuff with Wembanyama. Like, I've seen him. I watched Bilal Coulibaly play the other day. So I watched some of the Metropolitans 92, and like, I get it. Wembanyama's going to be the number 1 pick. Jazz don't really have any, opportunity to draft him. And because there's so many guys to cover with 3 first-round picks, I'm just honestly not wasting time on Wembanyama. And I'm kind of doing the same thing with Brandon Miller. I've watched Brandon Miller as a result of watching other guys on Alabama in some matchups with SEC teams as I try and watch other players in the draft. But really, I'm more like watching a guy like Noah Clowney at Alabama than I am Brandon Miller. And that same applies for Scoot Henderson, looking at guys like, Sidi Sissoko or Leonard Miller that are in the G League Ignite versus watching a guy like Scoot, who the Jazz don't have a chance at. And then even Amen Thompson, I've watched an overtime elite game. They're basically worthless to watch. They just don't really show you a whole lot other than how those guys move on the floor because the competition is so strange. But so I don't watch those guys. And because I don't do that, I don't really build a full board the way I think some guys do. I do think the Jazz are likely to be picking between 3 or 4 guys. So to narrow down the question that way, it's probably going to be Anthony Black, Asar Thompson, Taylor Hendricks, and maybe Jarris Walker, though I don't think he falls that far. If you want to throw Cason Wallace in there, you probably could. If you want to throw Grady Dick in there, you probably could. I would put those 2 guys later of those first 3. From talking to people, I think Anthony Black is going to be off the board by that point. I don't think he's going to be there at 9. I think the most likelihood is Taylor Hendricks is going to be there at 9. And then, of course, all the rumors lately are Bilal Coulibaly, who I watched and I liked quite a bit. I mean, he's just a freak athlete. He's got really, really terrific size for an 18-year-old. I think he's going to be really strong. I think he's going to end up with a body like OG Anunoby or Jaylen Brown. And I think those types of wings generally make it, even if they don't end up reaching their potential. But when those guys do reach their potential, they end up being very good players. So I would put Taylor Hendricks, of the guys who I realistically think are going to be there, Taylor Hendricks, Bilal Coulibaly, and maybe Asar Thompson there. And I would probably rank them Asar 1, maybe Taylor 2, and then maybe Bilal 3, but like really pretty interchangeable. I think all 3 of those guys have the same amount of question marks and potentially fatal flaws, and then also like really pretty intriguing upside.
So my number one guy that I would just absolutely love for the Jazz, and I honestly don't expect him to be there at 9, but somehow, somebody I'd love for him to be on the Jazz is Cam Whitmore. I mean, to me, I feel like when I look at him, I just see a guy that has an NBA body. Like, I see a guy that's going to come in and be ready to play for a team. I'm not saying he's going to be an all-star, maybe he could be or anything, but when I'm looking at all these other guys, I'm like, you're probably going to need some time, give him a couple months. I feel like with him, he's going to come in and he could help a team. I mean, I guess it really depends on where he goes to, what team it is, but am I crazy in thinking that if some way the Jazz were able to get him, that he would be an impact player for them right away?
He could. His passing is a real problem. Like, I mean, he's a terrible passer. He's slow to make reads, and that really is gonna, like, you got to think of what's gonna make a coach mad at you really early on. Like, if he can't trust you defensively, a coach is not going to play you, including Will Hardy on a young team. And then if you're like blowing passes, like you're not finding guys who are open in the corners. And look, this rookie, whoever comes in, even the number 9 pick, your job is to make Lowry make his life easy, make Walker's life easy, and then give the ball to Ochai or Colin or Simone Fontecchio, like all these guys who can already play in the NBA and have proven it. Your job as a rookie is to come in and kind of stay out of the way and don't hurt them. And if you don't pass the ball the way Cam Whitmore doesn't pass the ball, it's going to be a major question. Now, before he got to Villanova, he looked like a better passer. So some of it may have been their system, and they were a bit of a mess. But honestly, I look at a guy like Rajon Tucker, who Jazz fans might remember from a couple of years ago, was actually acquired by the Jazz, signed the same day that they traded for Jordan Clarkson. Like, freak athlete, decent shooter, absurd getting to the rim, pretty good handle. He never passed the ball. And now that was a different team. That was a team competing for a championship that had, or thought they were competing for a championship when they signed Rajon Tucker out of the G League. But like, those guys have all the physical tools. They can fly, finish on top of anybody. And if you just don't play basketball in a team environment, it's really hard to like get on the floor. So Cam Whitmore's body is ready. His athleticism is ready. His skill set probably translates to the NBA. And once you get more spacing, he's going to look a lot better than he did at Villanova. And even then, like, if he doesn't pass the ball, it's going to be hard for him to get on the floor really early in his career. So it might not be until the second half of the season. He may have to go and do what Ochai did and go down to the Stars and play for 20 games, 15 games, go through the whole showcase, and really learn what it means to be in a system before he's going to get real opportunities at the next level. Because, this time is still really valuable for guys like Ochai to be on the floor. I mean, these are developmental minutes that the Jazz want Ochai to come in and play. These are developmental minutes still for Colin Sexton, who does not know the Jazz system very well, having only played 50 or 60 games last season with that injury. So I'm not betting on any young player really getting a ton of playing time early, regardless of how like NBA ready they are.
Okay. And you already mentioned the French guy. Is it Bilal? Is that how you say it? Bilal Coulibaly?
Bilal, yeah, Coulibaly.
Wow. So I got to tell you, obviously, like you mentioned, there's a lot of hype right now with him with the Jazz, and apparently the Jazz are really high on him. I believe even the Ringer in their latest mock had him going 9 to the Jazz. Do you feel, I mean, it's crazy to me when I first started looking at the mocks maybe a couple weeks ago, a month, it felt like he was a 16th guy. He was there for the 16, even maybe later. And now they're talking about him being a top 10 pick. I mean, it sounds like you're high on him. I get scared. I guess it's just because I mentioned earlier, Exum. I'm still scared of that skinny guard comes in vibe, and I get that when I see him. Am I worrying too much about things I shouldn't be worrying about? Is he way better than Exum? I don't know. Talk me off the edge with this guy, I guess.
I think he has way fewer unknowns than Dante Exum, which is weird considering he's only been playing in this league with the Metropolitans 92 in their senior league really since January full time. No, you're not crazy. I mean, the league is full of some of these international guys who kind of make this late push and jump up draft boards and flame out in the league. I totally understand that. That's why I wouldn't say he's like, the most obvious guy at 9, because his physical tools, the things he does do, which he's a pretty great defensive player, has insane length. I bet you he has close to a 40-inch vertical. I saw one report that says he's actually probably closer to 6'8" than he is 6'6". Like, if that guy played college for 30 games and, let's replace him with Cam Whitmore and they just gave him the ball and let him do whatever he wanted to at times, the way Villanova did, like, he could average 15 points on a team that only wins 16 games. Like, he could have those exact same numbers and then be a much better defensive player. But, he's playing in a totally different league. Moving to America is a major question mark for a lot of guys. Sometimes they never come over and fit in comfortably. He's young. He's only 18 years old. He hasn't been playing through AAU basketball, preparing for the NBA the way a lot of guys have. He's had a late growth spurt, which is in a lot of ways positive, but in a lot of ways it kind of he's not used to playing this position that he's doing now. He was 5'11" for a long time, from my understanding, and then had this crazy growth spurt over the last 18 months and has really burst onto the scene. So there's those question marks that I think are absolutely legitimate. And he might be the highest upside swing you could take at 9, which, a lot of Jazz fans want to take a high upside swing and then maybe go for a slightly safer pick at 16 and then again at 28. And that's why I kind of like him at 9. The things he does well, he really does great. I think he's going to be a straight line driver like OG Anunoby. His handle isn't great right now by any means, but it's not unusable. I mean, some guys can't dribble. Royce O'Neal couldn't dribble and wasn't ever going to learn how to really dribble, and therefore wasn't really going to ever be great attacking the rim. I think Coulibaly can add that. His three-point shooting is really coming along, especially as a catch-and-shoot player. I don't think he's going to shoot off the dribble anytime soon. That's where a guy like Cam Whitmore ends up moving up to number 5, because that's an NBA skill that Coulibaly does not have. But his athleticism, his length, his growth, like his rapid growth on the court has been fascinating. And the fact that he's 18, playing in a league that I would say has more high leverage, real kind of competitive games than anything you're going to see in the G League, better players than you're going to see in college. Like if you watch one of their games, the Metropolitans 92, the guys they're playing against are like all former high-level college players, a lot of guys who played in summer leagues, like borderline pros in the NBA that went and found a way to play overseas. So it's not like he's playing against nobody. And that was the issue with Dante Exum. He was playing against high school kids in Australia before they had any of the like semblance of organized basketball that they do even now. So those questions I think are a little bit different, and why I like him a little bit more than some of those unknowns who have played at really small leagues and played in really small moments and had some flashes. He's playing at a pretty reasonably good league in their most important games and is now starting to play his best basketball. So I would compare him more a little bit to a guy who like has a breakout in the NCAA tournament than I would a Dante Exum. But those guys flame out too. I mean, the draft is littered with guys who bust because they played 18 games or 10 games really well in their conference tournament, in the NCAA tournament, and then never did anything at the next level.
Yeah, and I actually just recently, I think I may have just saw this last night, but his agent and also Wemby's agent is Rudy Gobert's agent. So yep. I guess he would have some kind of, maybe that would help him get familiar with Utah if he was drafted. I have no idea, but it's kind of cool to realize that. Who's somebody, let's go just stick with 9 and 16. Who is a player that you could see getting picked at 9 and then 16 that maybe a lot of us Jazz fans aren't even thinking about that wouldn't really surprise you?
At 9, I think the names are going to be pretty familiar, not to be boring, but like, I mean, maybe Grady Dick. And I know that just drives some Jazz fans crazy. I think that's probably a little bit high for him, other than the fact that he has an extremely translatable skill set, in my opinion, just as an elite shooter who can shoot off motion and off movement. And, I think he's actually probably a little bit better defensive player than people think, just because he's 6'8" and he really tries, or 6'8" in shoes and he really tries. I think he's a pretty fluid athlete. His vertical numbers weren't great at the combine, but like, he catches lobs in transition. He dunks on people occasionally. Like his athleticism is good enough to play in the NBA. I'm not worried about that at all. So, if you loved Kansas and let's say the Jazz said like, oh man, Bill Self, the coach at Kansas, like we just absolutely trust what he tells us and his intel. And he said before the season that Grady Dick's one of the best 3-point shooters he's ever seen, maybe the best he's ever had as a freshman coming in. And you think, well, you know what? All these other guys have major question marks. We're just going to go with the guy who we feel safe. That's where Grady Dick maybe comes into that spot. At 16, I mean, I've heard some names talking to some draft people that could surprise you, like maybe even Maxwell Lewis from Pepperdine could be a guy that the Jazz like. I think that's a little bit high for him, especially on the off chance that he could be there at 28. Like some of those guys, you probably don't need to reach on at 16 just because there's a chance they could be there at 28. I think you're more likely to either have a guy who falls to you, and that's why I think the Keontae George name has really kind of, been around, even though again, late mocks, as recently as yesterday, he's available at like 21. And that's coming from The Athletic. That's coming from ESPN. Like guys who are really in touch with the draft have Keontae George slipping into the 20s. So do you reach and grab him at 16? Probably not. If you think he can fall, you certainly don't need to trade up to get him. So I think those are kind of the interesting things. Some of the G League Ignite guys that fans probably haven't watched a lot of, Leonard Miller specifically, like it's not crazy to see him mocked at 16. That's actually pretty normal. I've seen his name a couple of times for the Jazz, but maybe someone you're not that familiar with, and just like super motor, plays hard, lit up the G League, was maybe the best, honestly, maybe the best G League Ignite player last year, just statistically, double every night. Does some crazy things for a 6'8", 6'9" guy with the ball in his hands who plays big but can really dribble, has terrific touch around the rim. Like those types of guys, if the Jazz end up with a guard at 9, like let's say Anthony Black slips to 9 or Asar Thompson slips to 9, and the Jazz were thinking, well, we're going to go big early and we'll get a guard at 16, and they end up with a guard at 9. Maybe they say, well, let's flip our board and let's go get a big man at 16 that we think can fit in between Walker and Lowry. And that is where like a Leonard Miller fits in. So that might be the type of name I would keep an eye on as Jazz fans.
That's actually, there was a mock draft done today by the Locked On guys, and David Locke was representing the Jazz, of course, and that's who he picked with the 16 was the Miller guy. So he's pretty high on him right now. So I think a lot of Jazz fans are probably going to start becoming familiar with that just because they follow the Locke podcast stuff there. Just to kind of end this draft talk here, I want two scenarios I'm asking from you. First, the first scenario, what do you think is the most realistic outcome for the Jazz on draft night? Like, are they just staying with their 3 picks? Is there going to be a trade maybe? And 2, what is something that, if it happens on draft night with the Jazz, would just totally blow your mind that you don't see it happening at all right now?
I guess trading any of their top 5 pieces right now would be what would surprise me the most. And, off the top of my head, that's Lauri Markkanen, Colin Sexton, Walker Kessler, Ochai Agbaji, and, enter whoever you want to really is the 5th guy. I will tell you, when Danny Ainge talks, those are the 4 names he mentions. Those are the 4 guys he consistently talks about, kind of like the core of the team. So if the Jazz were to trade any of those 4 guys, I'd be very surprised. Most likely is they make 2 picks at, obviously at the very least. I don't think they make any fewer than 2 picks. It would surprise me if they packaged, 28, 16, and 9 to move up to like 6. That would surprise me. I think they like the idea of having a couple of swings at the bat here. So that would be my guess. And then honestly, like if I were to make a bet right now, I would say the Jazz take Taylor Hendricks at 9 and take Jalen Hood-Schifino at 16. Like I think that's a very realistic scenario for the Jazz.
I could be down with that. All right, let's move on to some talk of the other offseason stuff that's going on here. Obviously, one of the big stories is Jordan Clarkson and his contract and him probably most likely opting out. Do you feel like Jordan Clarkson is like the Jazz's number 1 offseason target as far as re-signing him? And is it really important to the team to bringing him back?
I don't think it's critical, and not because Jordan Clarkson isn't beloved everywhere, and I think that's in the locker room, and I think that's, among the fan base at all. But I think there's a very realistic chance that they draft a guy who does similar things to Jordan Clarkson as a leading, or as a scoring guard. I think that's what Colin Sexton's ideal role is, or what his best role is. So it's already a little bit reductive. And then, we'll see what Jordan Clarkson gets. Now, if it's a good deal, I really think one of the things we need to recognize about Danny Ainge and Justin Zanuck and how they're running the team right now is like value of assets seems to be a priority. So beyond just the idea of like, hey, like let's build this team up as good as we can or something like that. Like they want to make sure that their assets maintain value. So I think one of the reasons they traded Bojan Bogdanovic for Kelly Olynyk, which in retrospect, like probably wasn't a very good trade, but you extended out Kelly Olynyk. You've got him for 2 years. He's got a very tradable contract. A good team could use him. He could get thrown around in the draft, like as a piece for like a team like Dallas, maybe coming up next week. Like that's a team that might have interest in him, or a team that says, hey, we need a little bit more depth and we're willing to give up an asset for him. Like I think the Jazz like that. And I think they felt like Bojan Bogdanovic's expiring contract, as good as he was going to be hard to move, and they were going to have to extend him for a number that they didn't want to extend him at, and then it was going to make him even more difficult to trade. So I think they like the idea of maintaining a value of an asset without getting locked into something that gets them stuck somewhere. So Jordan Clarkson, if you can sign him at a good number that feels very tradable, great. do it. That I think that's how they're going to view him, more so than like, hey, what does Jordan Clarkson, the person or the player, mean to the team if you lose him on the court? I think it's more about his value as an asset based on just where the Jazz are in their rebuild right now.
And then obviously just the whole rest of the free agency class this year. I mean, it's well known it's not that great. Is there a player that you're looking at when you look over the free agent list and you say that's somebody I would really like to see the Jazz go after and hopefully land them?
Yeah, I think the names that make sense would be somebody like Grant Williams. And I know that's kind of just a boring name, but he's been out there. But he comes in, he fills a role, he gives you front court depth. He could probably start at forward if you end up moving Kelly Olynyk or want Kelly Olynyk to come off the bench, or if you want Grant Williams to come off the bench. But he's got that type of positional versatility. I think Boston's in such a difficult spot financially that it's going to be hard to pay him. And again, if the Jazz just feel like, well, I mean, that's a cheap asset that Danny Ainge drafted originally. He's going to be a good NBA player for the next 3 or 4 years. He fits every roster in the NBA. If you just decided that, like, man, you got free agent cap space, you don't see a trade that comes with like taking on a bad salary and a first-round draft pick kind of out there on the horizon that makes a lot of sense, and you just want an asset that either you can play or you could trade in a couple of years, or even this season to a team that wants him, I think Grant Williams could maybe get a little money from the Jazz if they wanted to. But again, that's just kind of a guess. I don't think they go after Kyle Kuzma. I don't think they go after Austin Reeves. I don't think they go after Gabe Vincent. Like, I'm not sure those guys would want what the Jazz are offering unless the Jazz are just offering a ton of money. And I don't think the Jazz are wanting to sacrifice their flexibility financially just to make a signing this year.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. And just to wrap things up here, just final question, kind of go back to getting to know you. Something I'm very curious about as an outside fan here is the way the job works for you guys as beat writers or people covering the Jazz. So what does it look like for you when you're full in on the Jazz season? Like, what time do you get up? Do you get like a schedule the day up from the Jazz saying this is when practice is, such and such? Then obviously you have your day job with KSL Sports and the radio and stuff. How is your day going during a Jazz season?
Busy right now because I do radio and cover the games, so yeah, my show starts at 10, so I'm up, kind of doing general prep, or a lot of the prep is done the night before, just because if it's a Jazz game, what you're going to be talking about the next day. You just kind of generally always have your feelers up. I'm on Twitter all the time, trying to see what people are talking about or what the big stories are. So I'm not up crazy early, but I do have to take my kids to school and then get to the show. So, I'm up and moving by 7:30, usually at the, about that average time. And then, yeah, a lot of nights you're up, if there's a Jazz night, up until midnight, 1:00, very easily. And then, in all honesty, just because if it's an off night, it's not like I'm going to bed at 9:30 to make up for sleep. Like, I don't want to play with my schedule that much. So I just maintain a pretty basic schedule. I'm up late almost every night, at least until midnight. I can't remember the last time I went to bed before midnight. And usually it's well after 1:00. And that's just pretty standard just because the lifestyle requires it. And I don't want to throw that out of whack. So when the kids are out of school, I can sleep in a little bit later, but still have to be up early for the show. As far as practice goes and stuff like that, Jazz PR is good. They will tell us when things are. Like, we'll get a text usually. Let's say there's a Jazz game, and we know their next game's at home. If the game ends at 10:30, we'll get a text around like 11:15 before midnight, certainly saying practice tomorrow or no practice tomorrow. And then that night we'll get another one that says, hey, practice tomorrow or no practice, or there is a shoot around, there's not a shoot around. Usually that's conveyed the night before. And then if there's something like, a draft event going on for just the media only, they'll call us a week out and let us know what their plans are just so we can plan accordingly.
Is it ever hard for you? I mean, it sounds like you've been kind of in the know of things for a minute, but was it hard for you at first when they started giving you information like, hey, we've got this thing coming up, but just saying like maybe they have a new jersey they're getting ready to release and you get the information a week out and stuff, but they're like, but do not talk about it with anybody. Do not release this info till such and such. Was that hard for you to sit on that kind of information at first, or no?
Not particularly. I mean, I'm sure I remember I reported things early that I shouldn't have just because I was young and just like not realizing that locker room conversations are not things you can like live tweet. And that's something that I think a lot of young reporters do on accident. Something I certainly made the mistake of once with even Rudy Gobert. And he didn't like that. So you kind of learn quickly the mistakes you make if you want to be welcome and have guys being willing to talk to you. As far as the stuff that like, if the Jazz are saying like, hey, we're going to have, this is like a good example would be like, hey, we're going to release an end of season award campaign for Lauri Markkanen for most improved player, or for Walker Kessler for rookie of the year. Maybe they'll let you see like, hey, this is what the campaign's going to look like, just so it doesn't catch you off guard, or just so like it doesn't hit a national writer first and be like, hey, why are the national guys getting stuff? Like, we cover this team every day. Like, why are they getting unique access to things? And the Jazz are good about making sure we kind of have opportunities to see those things. And really, the nice thing is it just allows us to prepare our work, our jobs, our articles that are coming out, so we aren't blindsided at 7:30 at night and being like, well, I'm supposed to write this article now and I'm not near my computer because I still have to have a normal life in the summer. Right. So they do try and make sure that, I think on some of those heads up kind of moments, we have an idea. But, we learn about breaking news a lot of the ways, the same way everyone else does, whether that's from Woj or Shams or whatever. A lot of like the major stuff that is like top secret, you hear some of it. Some of the things certainly come out a little bit early before they get announced. And then you want to double and triple and quadruple check things. And, that stuff, it's more like, it's not that you want to get it out. It's more so that you don't want to get it wrong. So you sit on it, because getting it wrong of being like, oh, Brian Bailey's going to the Atlanta Hawks as an assistant coach. Like, if you report that and then he has a change of heart a week later because it wasn't fully decided yet, or Quinn Snyder says, oh, I didn't realize Igor Kokoshkov was going to be available, he's going to take Brian Bailey's spot. Now all of a sudden you look like a bozo. So some of that stuff is just like the upside of reporting it early versus the downside of getting it wrong. You're always balancing that.
So here's something I like to ask some of the local beat writers when I interview them, and maybe it's a pat myself on the back kind of thing or whatever. But have you ever seen as something that I've tweeted or put out there and you were like, oh crap, I didn't know that was happening, and then all of a sudden maybe you go to the Jazz practice or Jazz PR is like, well, I guess this is out now, such and so. Has anything like that ever come out that you're aware of?
I'm not sure, like privileged stuff, you know what I mean? And that's not a knock on you at all. But I think like, I think you're good at gathering information widely around, like you cast a wide net around what information is circulating. So like I've seen you tweet stuff that like, a player is working out for the Jazz or something like that, and that's just recency bias or whatever, that I've seen stories and be like, oh, I hadn't seen that. And there's value in that, certainly, where I'll be like, oh, which is why I do follow you on Instagram. I see stuff as I scroll that I may miss otherwise, in my other day-to-day things. But no, yeah, you do a nice job with that accumulating knowledge with the wide net.
I just asked that mostly because I can't remember what time it was, but somebody told me of a time that they went and somebody with, I don't know if it was Jazz PR or somebody was just totally pissed off at me for something. And there was a good few months that I was not getting as much information, it felt like, of things. Not that I get information from the Jazz, but it was just kind of like a weird vibe going on. But it's always funny to hear that from me as just a dude. It's just some fan kind of thing and stuff like that, not trying to piss the team off or whatever. But anyways, final question here for you. You talked about your journey getting to where you are. If somebody is coming up in the game right now, maybe they're graduating high school and going into college, is there any kind of advice that you would give them if they're wanting to get into kind of like sports broadcasting or anything to do with sports?
Yeah, there's a couple things I would tell everyone, and kind of a new thing as well. First of all, it's not as hard to get into as you think. Like, it's easier to get internships, easier to get jobs like in like kind of early level production, like, running the board for stuff, like especially on the radio side. Like, that is not as hard to get into as I think a lot of people think. So if it's something you're interested in, like a couple of times a year, I know even at the Zone, like we're asking like, hey, if you're interested, come join us. Or like Locke needs an intern. Like, those are good opportunities. Apply for those. They're not impossible to get. And there's several radio stations around, and there's a lot of different media outlets to write for. So getting in the door is probably not the hurdle that a lot of people think it is. It's probably intimidating. It might be the most intimidating part of it, but it's actually not the hardest part. The hardest part is sticking around. So, you're going to have to put up with a lot. It's going to push you to your breaking point a lot of times, whether you're like waiting to get made full time, or like to have the responsibility that you want to have, or like the opportunities to cover things you want. Like, those aren't always going to be straightforward, and it's never linear. Like, I went from covering the Jazz and having an afternoon drive radio show to covering high school football games and high school soccer games and like JV teams. Like, but I didn't have a job in radio at the point. So I had to go back down and do something else and try and stay relevant and continue to work in a way I'd never done before and sharpen my skills. So it's not a straight line. It's not linear. It will push you to your breaking point, and everyone has dealt with that, I promise you. And sometimes it just becomes a waiting game that people can't wait any longer. And I understand that if you have a family, you have kids, or you need to start making real money or whatever, like it's going to be really hard for you to wait that out. And if you do, it can be beneficial, but it's going to push you to your breaking point. That's the other thing I would say, and that's just everyone right now, is just show up. Just keep showing up. Like, it's so easy to stop showing up when you get disheartened, to not cover a practice or not cover a game or not go to work or, not do whatever your Sunday shift is if you're a weekend guy in radio. Like, just always showing up is the most important thing you can do, because the second you become unreliable and don't show up, you drop to the bottom of the ladder immediately. And enough people are going to not show up that if you wait long enough and you keep showing up, like, you're going to climb that ladder because enough people fall off of it. So showing up so consistently, I would say, is the most important thing, especially like for this generation that's, 18, 17, 19, 20, like coming out of high school and college right now. Like, I think going through a pandemic was really insane, and not knowing like what your responsibilities were, like going actually physically to work. I totally understand why that trained people in a bizarre way. And I'm not saying you can't work from home. Like, I work from home a ton. I'm at home right now, but when you need to show up, show up. And that's going to be the most important thing you can do.
Man, that's some good advice. I appreciate that. That's good to hear. I mean, honestly, even for people like my age and that are in the late 30s or whatever, that's what it's important thing. Like, even it's just showing up to do content things, doing these interviews and stuff like that. Just get yourself out there. That's the most important thing. So that's really good advice. I appreciate your time today, Ben. Do you want to get your plugs in? Let everyone where they can find you and hear you on the radio?
Yeah, read me at KSLSports.com. I mean, no knock on anyone else. I know what my job is. I think I've got the most draft coverage of anybody out there locally. So if you're looking for kind of individual breakdowns of guys in the draft coming up in the next week for the Jazz, go to KSLSports.com. I've got 5 more guys that are going to be late first-round picks coming out on Thursday, and then another 5 coming out on Friday. So there's going to be even 10 more names there. So we got you pretty well covered. And then, of course, the KSL Sports Zone 97.5 and 1280, 10 to noon, Monday through Friday with Jake Scott.
Awesome. Yeah, catch him there, folks. I appreciate your time there, Ben, and good luck to you this whole coming week. Hope you have fun with the draft like all us Jazz fans are. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, should be fun.